Beste kijkers, welkom bij de Week van de Klassieken. Onze partner in Leiden, het Rijksmuseum van Oudheden, is vanmiddag al begonnen met de openingslezing, maar nu is het aan ons in Amsterdam in het Allard Pierson te openen. Mijn naam is Lezing Panel, ik ben conservator Griekse wereld en Oude Nabije Oosten in het Allard Pierson en heb mede het programma georganiseerd voor deze week. Voor ons is het een extra feestelijke dag, omdat dit ook de geboortedag is van onze naamgever, Allard Pierson. De Week van de Klassieken staat dit jaar in het teken van de inclusieve oudheid. En niet alleen was de wereld van de Grieken en de Romeinen in de oudheid, maar vooral bekijken we hoe onze perceptie, hoe wij de oudheid benaderen, hoe inclusief die is. Dus tijdens deze week willen we een hoop inspiratie opdoen, met elkaar in gesprek gaan, open gesprek houden en hopelijk te komen tot nieuwe vragen en nieuwe perspectieven. De reden dat u nu thuis naar een beeldscherm zit te staren en helaas niet hier in het museum bent, is u bekend. Voor ons een positief puntje. Bood dit de mogelijkheid om buitenlandse experts uit te nodigen en dus bij te dragen aan deze week. En het programma van het Allard Pierson is hier dan ook op gestoeld. We hebben buitenlandse experts gevraagd om te kijken hoe de praktijk bij hen is en vervolgens gaan we dat vertalen naar onze eigen praktijk. Zo hebben we vandaag professor Edith Hall die gaat spreken. Morgen hebben we Craig Cipolla, een archeoloog uit Canada, die gaat spreken over de toekomst van mediterrane archeologie. We hebben Sanchita Balachandran uit Baltimore, die gaat kijken naar inclusieve klassieke collecties in universiteitsmusea. En we hebben Jeffrey Murray, die ons gaat vertellen hoe de klassieke talen zijn ingebed in Afrika. Kortom, we hebben een bomvol programma. Kijk vooral op onze website www.weekvandeklassieken.nl of Allard Pierson naar onze agenda. Mocht u vragen hebben, stel die op de mail. Kunt u die op de mail sturen naar info@weekvandeklassieken.nl. Ik ga nu het woord geven aan mijn collega Gert-Jan van Wijngaarden, die de spreekster van vandaag gaat introduceren. En ik hoop u alle de rest van de week terug te zien. Gert-Jan.
Dankjewel, Laurien. Ook namens mij van harte welkom op deze bijeenkomst. Laurien de Gelder heeft mij gevraagd deze bijeenkomst te modereren en ook de spreker bij u te introduceren. We hebben professor Edith Hall gevraagd om ons een overzicht te geven hoe het thema van de inclusieve oudheid, hoe dat wordt vormgegeven in het Verenigd Koninkrijk en dan vooral met betrekking tot musea met een klassieke collectie. En we hopen dan in de discussie achteraf ook de koppeling met onze eigen praktijk in Nederland te kunnen maken. Edith Hall is professor in klassieke cultuur aan King's College in Londen. En voordat zij die betrekking aannam, ik meen in 2017, bekleedde zij posities aan diverse Europese en Amerikaanse universiteiten, waaronder in Leiden in 2013 en in 2017 gaf zij les aan de Universiteit Leiden als spreker of als Spinoza Fellow. Ze is een specialist in Griekse literatuur en dan vooral Griekse tragedie, Grieks theater in meer algemene zin, maar zij heeft ook veel gepubliceerd en lezingen gegeven over de oudheid in het algemeen. En in haar benadering van klassieke cultuur speelt diversiteit, etniciteit, gender en sociale klasse een hele belangrijke rol, zoals u zometeen ook zult horen. In 2014 publiceerde zij een boek, Introducing the Ancient Greeks, dat meerdere malen herdrukt is en ook prijzen heeft gekregen. En ik zelf gebruik dat boek als handboek in een van mijn collegereeksen. En ik weet dat een aantal studenten die die collegereeks hebben gevolgd, hier nu online aanwezig is. Dus blijkbaar waren zij niet ontmoedigd door dat boek, maar enthousiast geworden over deze thematiek. Meer recentelijk, in 2020, publiceerde Edith Hall samen met Henry Stead een boek A People's History of Classics. En over de klassieke studiën en sociale klassen in Engeland. En in haar lezing, die we zo zullen horen, zal zij diverse voorbeelden uit dat boek geven. We krijgen zo dus de lezing, die is vooraf opgenomen, maar Edith Hall is ook hier aanwezig en wij zullen na de lezing met haar in discussie gaan over de punten die zij daar aan de orde stelt. En u kunt via de Q&A-functie in de Zoom vragen stellen aan professor Hall. Dat kan in het Nederlands of in het Engels. Daar waar nodig zullen wij voor u vertalen. En hiermee, without further ado, denk ik dat ik het woord geef aan professor Edith Hall.
Hello, I'm Professor Edith Hall, and this is a short lecture on how museums could improve the way that they display objects from classical antiquity, talking about how the objects got into the museums and how they've inspired visitors. First, I'd like to thank you for this kind invitation. I've spent many happy hours in the Leiden's Rijksmuseum when lecturing for Professor Ineke Sluiter at the university there, and I always enjoy my collaborations with colleagues in the Netherlands. So I was delighted when Lorien de Gelder invited me to join you in this exciting initiative. I'm flattered because I am no specialist in museum studies, so I apologise in advance for any displays of ignorance. But with Dr. Henry Stead, I produced a book and a website devoted to the participation of the British working classes in the history of classics. We came across many stories which may be of interest to you as I think about stimulating public interest in classical materials in Dutch museums. I've also tried out some of these ideas while campaigning for better access to classical subject matter in British state education with my ACE campaign, and both websites are listed here. The issue of public museum collections is a burning one in Britain. The National Trust has recently finally acknowledged that more than 90 of its most prestigious properties, often neoclassical Palladian stately homes, were built on money derived from imperial ventures, especially in India and in the slave plantations of the British West Indies. An important example is Basildon House. Now, this is an outstanding Neo-Palladian architectural pile in Berkshire, and that obliterates any reference to the source of the money that built it, India. It was the creation of a Yorkshire yeoman farmer, Francis Sykes, but he arrived in Calcutta at the age of 18 to work for the East India Company, and he rose to become immensely powerful in Bengal, second only to Robert Clive. And when he returned to England in 1769, he had amassed a gargantuan private fortune. He was the archetypal nabob. Sykes formally joined the aristocracy when he was made a baronet in 1781, though allegations of corruption dogged his attempts at a parliamentary career. His ascent of the class ladder found its ultimate expression in his self-fabrication at Basildon as a classically educated member of the landowning gentry. And every detail from the plant pots and statues in the extensive gardens to the Doric facades and internal plasterwork reinforces the classicizing illusion. But the property tells you none of this. The taste for the antique at that time can be seen even earlier in dozens of 18th century stately homes, usually built by nouveau riche bankers, merchants, or adventurers returned from the colonies. At least they ordered them to be built, hired fashionable architects and interior decorators, and handed over the physical work to local labourers. As Brecht put it in the opening lines of his poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads, composed in 1935. Who built seven-gated Thebes? In the books are stated the names of kings. Did the kings drag the boulders up? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built it up so many times? Where are the houses in golden gleaming Lima, where the people who built it live? The night the Great Wall of China was completed, where did the masons go? Rome is great and full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? But British public opinion is now divided. Many deplore what they call the trashing of the glorious British imperial past for the sake of woke political correctness. On the other hand, many smaller museums have been organising really wonderful exhibitions and activities aimed at diversifying their visitor base way beyond prosperous middle-class white people and engaging with contemporary political concerns. And these include the Ure Museum at Reading, the Carleon Museum at Cirencester, and the Cambridge University Museum of Classical Archaeology. The Museum of London has been especially proactive, emphasising how the archaeology of Roman Britain can demonstrate for us that our islands have been inhabited by an international population of very diverse ethnicity already now for at least 2,000 years. We're all descendants of immigrants. There are, for example, African heritage bones amongst the remains found in a Roman-era London cemetery. One aspect of British museums and archaeological sites that I've investigated is the visits paid by African Americans campaigning in the 19th century for the abolition of slavery. William Wells Brown was one of the first former slaves to authorize himself as a legitimate historical subject entitled to comment on the history of a nation that had denied him his own history, that's the United States. His view of America and its history stemmed from his personal experience and his extended visit to Britain, where he arrived in 1849. Thinking about the narratives encoded on ancient Roman monuments, which he'd seen in Britain, prompted Brown to question the very way that his white countrymen had distorted their public history. He said, "I once stood on the walls of an English city, up to Rome, built by enslaved Britons when Julius Caesar was their master. The image of the ancestors of President Lincoln and Montgomery Blair, as represented in Britain, it was carved upon monuments of Rome, where they may still be seen in their chains." Ancestry is something the white American should not speak of. And through this reference to the Roman subjugation of Britain, Brown here subverted white North American patriots' exceptionalist view of their past, a view which made extravagant claims about their country's innovative nature as a republic heralding a new era in liberty and world history. Yet the world history of slavery, in Brown's interpretation, made it impossible to assert that any such significant rupture had ever been created by the founding fathers. Within the continuity that he assumes, Brown instead uncovers a foundational history of an older republic, empire, Rome. And this radical resituation of American history in a longer perspective, leading directly back to Roman colonization, reveals that current masters of America to be descendants of slaves themselves. And Frederick Douglass also visited many museums when he was on speaking tour in Britain. The museum at Leeds, where our youngest child is studying at university, has made a feature of this. But today I'm most interested in social class. Something that museums have historically erased is the vast contribution made to their collections by the poor and uneducated who came across finds in the course of their work or recreation out of doors. Take the Corbridge Lanx, a tray for distributing food and drinks at banquets. It's a stunning example of late Roman decorated silver plate made in Asia Minor or North Africa in the 4th century. Apollo stands at the entrance to his shrine on Delos with Athena, Artemis his sister, his mother Leto seated, and Athena is also beautifully depicted. The other female may be Leto's sister Ortygia. And the detail stands out even better in this 1736 engraving. But a local record from May 1735 says that Isabel Cutter, daughter of Thomas Cutter of Corbridge, blacksmith, aged 9 years, did on or about the 10th day of February last find an ancient silver piece of plate in a great measure covered with the earth, one end sticking out of the ground, at a certain place within this manor, near the north bank of the River Tyne by the water's edge. Lucky Isabel! Finding treasure is every child's fantasy. I wonder what she made of those gorgeous pagan goddesses. Children of her age usually love Greek myths. And I do hope her blacksmith father was nice to her. He sold it to the local goldsmith, making more than £30 for it, which is now worth about £8,000. Now that may have felt like a lot of money, but I actually suspect he was ripped off. And the loaded Duke of Northumberland subsequently acquired it, and his descendant bestowed it on the British Museum in 1993. Visual culture often proved a significant avenue for lower class people to access classical civilization. And that's because those whose occupations involve farming, care of horses, mining, digging, game keeping, fishing, dredging, and other outdoor pursuits were much more likely to come across ancient remains in their neighborhoods. The hoard of Roman ceramics, which the pottery workers of Stoke in Staffordshire felt prefigured their own trade, was dug up by construction workers in 1747. In the mid-19th century, a hoard of 400 Roman silver denarii was discovered by brickmakers in Lancashire, and they were given to the Harris Museum at Preston, where they still are. The miners of northeastern England prided themselves on their knowledge of Roman Britain, and their interest is reflected in the banner of the Fenhall Drift Lodge, Lanchester Miners, which depicts a 20th century miner and a Roman soldier as equally at home in the underground caverns south of Hadrian's Wall. The earliest precious examples of ancient Greek script in Britain were discovered by builders, and 2 bronze plaques were found during the construction of the railway station in York, which opened in 1841. They were dedicated to the gods in the 1st century by a man called Demetrius. And the Museum of Carleon Antiquarian Association, which opened in 1850, was built precisely to house the Roman inscriptions and artifacts, which labourers and farmers found locally. Carleon is the site of Roman Isca Augusta, the base of the 2nd Augustan Legion. And middle-class antiquarians, including the local vicar, received and sometimes grabbed off these workers Roman artifacts, the workers who dug their ditches and broke the stones for their roads. The famous Carleon Labyrinth mosaic was discovered by grave diggers at the parish church of St. Cadoc. And a beautiful ivory tragic mask was found by a man digging in the drain of the Castle Villa, which was actually the residence of John Jenkins, authoritarian manager and co-owner of the tin works. Museums in Britain were visited by a much wider cross-section of the public than their equivalents in Italy, France, and Germany, where the admission of visitors to the princely galleries was more closely monitored. There was, indeed, in Britain a sense that art and archaeology somehow belonged to the nation rather than exclusively to wealthy individuals. And actually, free admission has always been customary. These were spaces where, at least in theory, people of all classes were offered the same experience. And they were permitted to see objects that in the past would have been the preserve of the few. At a time of wild disparities of educational provision, this was already a considerable, if grudging, concession. Lower class visitors were drawn to museums out of curiosity, and actually their memoirs often implied that what they saw nurtured an impulse towards self-education. When Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach toured the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in 1710, he was actually shocked at what he called the vulgarity of the visited. Ralph Thoresby, whose collection at the Museum Thoresbyanum, founded by his father in Leeds in the late 17th century, included many Roman British finds, but he complained bitterly about visiting plebeians. And a Prussian traveller was surprised in the 1780s that the visitors to the British Museum, founded in 1753, were various, some, I believe, of the very lowest classes of the people of both sexes. Museum keepers expressed fears about these vulgar people and the behaviour which they associated with the policy of free admission. And in 1815, the British Museum's principal librarian, Joseph Planter, complained to its trustees that our popular visitors, in the fervour of independence, pride themselves in showing a disdain of order. And Gustav Wagen was distressed by the chaotic and dirty masses crowding the National Gallery. The desire to display objects from classical antiquity, especially after the British Museum acquired Sir William Hamilton's extraordinary classical collection in 1784, and of course the Parthenon sculptures from Lord Elgin in 1816, led to the 19th century emergence of municipal museums. Now, those Parthenon sculptures have an alternative history very different from that on the website of the British Museum. It was Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, who had them amputated from their original sites on the Athenian Acropolis. His own fortune derived from the labours of industrial workers in lime kilns, coal mines and iron foundries on his Scottish estates. And he'd originally planned to house sculptures at his own estate. Several architects drew up plans for turning it into a grand Caledonian Parthenon. He commissioned expensive Doric columns, which never ever got installed. Instead, they now grace the Perth Sheriff Court. But he ran out of money in 1816, persuaded the government to buy his booty. But there was substantial opposition to the payment of £35,000. Many Britons were outraged. Most of them didn't have the vote, let alone a say, in the report of the Select Committee, which recommended the purchase. There'd been a catastrophic harvest in 1816. Many were starving. The debates in the House of Commons were vigorous. One MP stressed, in an allusion to the Gospel of Matthew 7:9, that many soldiers had inadequate pensions. If we could not give them bread, we ought not to indulge ourselves in the purchase of stones. The purchase was opposed by both John Christian Kirwan, MP for Carlisle, and the owner of coal mines, on the ground that times were unusually hard, and the much more radical Whig MP for Coventry, Peter Moore, who said he would demand the money for his hungry constituents rather than give such a sum to look at broken legs, arms and shoulders. And this cartoon by George Cruikshank is entitled "The Elgin Marbles or John Bull Buying Stones at the Time His Numerous Family Want Bread." Cruikshank depicts the leader of the House of Commons, Lord Castlereagh, as a sinister salesman trying to entice John Bull, the archetypal sensible Briton, to buy broken statues. And Castlereagh says, "Here's a bargain for you, Johnny, only £35,000. I bought them on purpose for you. Never think of bread when you can have stones so wondrous cheap." Bull, in patched clothes, is surrounded by his emaciated children. Mrs. Bull's baby is sucking a meatless bone, and other children shout, "Don't buy them, Daddy, don't buy them, Daddy. We don't want stones. Give us bread, give us bread, give us bread." A modern museum exhibition could also show how the Parthenon frieze was treated to a class-conscious reading by Godfrey Sykes, and that was for the Sheffield Mechanics Institute. Sykes was a poor Yorkshireman who left his apprenticeship to an engraver and enrolled at the newly opened Sheffield School of Art in 1843. All his other works include paintings of people at work in smithies, forges and steelworks. Perhaps it was his reputation for the sympathetic portrayal of industrial work that led in 1854 to him being commissioned to design a frieze by the Sheffield Mechanics Institute. That had opened in 1832 and had several hundred members, including 100 women. Now, rather than simply reproducing the Parthenon frieze, Sykes adapted it to a Sheffield context. He substituted more than 60 artisans, labourers, miners and steelworkers for Phidias' procession of Athenian horsemen. Headed by Minerva, Athena and other gods, in Sykes' vision, the workers of Sheffield proudly wheeled their tools and pushed their trucks around the whole 13 painted panels, which are in oil on paper and trompe l'oeil instead of relief sculpture. I think museums could do far more to think about the way their holdings have impacted ordinary people's lives. In 1820, an impoverished crofter turned stonemason, Alexander MacDonald, moved to the city of Aberdeen. Now, there was a huge supply of beautiful raw local stone in the form of granite, which could be made into matte surfaced mantelpieces, paving stones, and funeral monuments. But Alexander was frustrated because neither he nor anyone else could work out how to give this gritty local stone a sheen and polish equivalent to that which could be given to marble. And in 1829, he heard about an exhibition at the British Museum of ancient sculptures from Egypt, some of them from the Hellenistic period. And they had been brought to Britain by the explorer Giovanni Belzoni, who was a former fairground strongman entertainer. MacDonald travelled all the way to London to visit the exhibition, and he was astonished to see that the luminous statues made of granite, even those with rounded surfaces, were highly polished. The Egyptians and Ptolemies mysteriously had known how to do what no stonemason had ever done since. For example, on this red granite statue wearing a double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which was found in the temple enclosure of Mut at Karnak. MacDonald was stunned and set about trying to reproduce this lost art. But polishing by hand was far too laborious and time-consuming. He did crack the problem of the rounded surfaces by using a wheel turned by two workers. But since everything had to be done by manual labour, it took days. The Ptolemies possessed enormous armies of slaves who could be kept at the lathe for entire lifetimes. The breakthrough came when MacDonald's neighbour, who ran a comb-making factory, let him use power from his precious new steam engine, and with the aid of steam power, which drove the cutting and polishing machinery, monumental polished granite artefacts at last became feasible again. And the granite industry of Aberdeen was now unstoppable. Polished, shiny granite gravestones became the rage, and ever bigger monuments and edifices were built. They were constructed out of granite, exported from Aberdeen to all over the British Empire. In London alone, think of Waterloo Bridge, the terraces of the Houses of Parliament, or the fountains in Trafalgar Square. The visual impact of Ptolemaic statues was therefore instrumental in altering the mode of granite production, the appearance of British imperial cities, and in due course, the entire economy of North East Scotland. The British Museum should also be celebrating George Smith. Now, he's a working class intellectual who made the first crucial steps in deciphering the mysterious Cypriot syllabic script. Brought up in a Chelsea slum tenement after minimal schooling in which he learned little except the Old Testament, Smith was apprenticed to an engraving company at the age of just 14, and he spent every leisure minute in the British Museum poring over the recent finds from Nineveh and Babylon. He taught himself all the ancient languages, including cuneiform, and got a low-paid post as a repairer, just piecing together inscribed fragments. He became indispensable to the actual star of cuneiform studies, Major General Sir Henry Kreswick Rawlinson. Almost all of the third and fourth volumes of Rawlinson's cuneiform inscriptions were actually contributed by Smith, whose own works changed the face of Assyrian studies. Besides an avalanche of game-changing monographs, including the enormous Annals of Assurbanipal, Smith also brought the world the Babylonian creation poem Enuma Elish. But his most famous feat was a sensational public reading in 1872 of his translation of the account of the deluge from the Epic of Gilgamesh. That made it difficult to read the flood in the Old Testament as anything other than myth rather than history. The translation Smith gave to the world between 1873 and 1876 changed our understanding of the history of literature forever. And he also cracked that mysterious archaic syllabary of Cyprus. But I can't finish without mentioning the work of Professor Vinnie Norskov, who's director of the Museum of Ancient Art at Aarhus University in Denmark. Now, she's celebrating Danish women involved in the evolution of the national museums. Anna-Marie Carl Nielsen in 1903 travelled to Athens and actually made a copy of the Poros group from the gable of the old Athena temple and copies of other ancient artworks. Her ability to recreate in three-dimensional form and vivid colour was remarkable. Over the following years, she sold several copies to museums in Berlin, Dresden, and Erlangen. Brewer Carl Jacobsen bought 4 of the copies for the Royal Casting Collection in Copenhagen. And Anne-Marie Carl Nielsen's archaic copies can also be found today at the Carl Nielsen Museum in Odense and at Aarhus. And as an original artist, the impact of Greek art on her style was also palpable. And to conclude, it's female labour that's celebrated by Cliff Rowe, a British painter whose conscious mission was to put working people at the centre of the visual arts. A working class boy from Wimbledon, he left school at 14 and managed to get into the Wimbledon Art School. The economic crisis and the growing threat of fascism in the 1930s persuaded him to set up the Artists' International Association. Now, most of Rowe's paintings lend beauty and grandeur to scenes of people working in industry. For example, his famous Woman Cleaning a Loco Boiler. But in Three Graces, the power of the image derives from Rowe's recasting of 3 women working at a factory conveyor belt in the unmistakable postures of the 3 Graces. The one in the centre with her back to the viewer and the others at the side. This design concept goes all the way back to antiquity, features in a famous mural at Pompeii and a mosaic in the Shaba Museum in Syria. And this arrangement of a beautiful trio of women is recurrent in Western art from at least as early as Botticelli's Primavera of 1486. And its most famous instance is probably in Canova's neoclassical statue group of around 1816. But the idea that such a vision of classical perfection could be located in an industrial setting with low-income women in the roles of Grecian goddesses, calmly in control of the complicated machinery they're operating, illustrates the profundity of Rowe's revolutionary political aesthetic. So museums could do so much more to address how the public has contributed to the artifacts museums contain, not only by finding them and in the history of visiting them, but by being inspired by them. Adding personal stories to silent objects can and should make all the difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hall, for this very inspiring presentation in which you covered an enormous range of different topics. As I said in my introduction, the audience can now engage in questions, and in order to do so, you should use the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. Meanwhile, while listening to this lecture, a number of questions raised here in the hall, so I'll start off the discussion. In the beginning, you state that classicism in Britain, at least to an extent, has been funded by what I would call the spoils of imperialism, unequal colonial exploitation of resources, the slave trade, etc., etc. And you also say that making this background visible actually encounters resistance by many people who see this as the thrashing of our glorious imperial past. Yet, as you also showed, many museums do try to make this history visible. And there's a contradiction there. So my question is about visitor reaction. What type of public reaction have these exhibitions drawn? And can you elaborate whether these initiatives draw a new public for classical culture, or whether they actually succeed in changing the perspective of an existing public?
That's a very good question, to which the answer is extremely complicated. There are 3 different types of organization all wrapped up into this. One is the National Trust. I don't know if you have an equivalent exactly in the Netherlands, but this is an organization that has bought up stately homes with all of their contents. And it's a great national pastime to go to one of these on a weekend. They have very recently got some rather radical new people at the top who finally, and in my view, very excellently, have decided that they've got to be honest about where the money came from that funded all of this. So that you can both have the fantasy of going to the beautiful building and walking around the beautiful park and looking at the beautiful pictures, but also be educated in terms of British imperial history. This, however, from the constituency that tends to go to them, which is people over 50 years old and retired people who want the fantasy, has attracted a lot of resistance. But the debate has definitely opened up the discussion to a much wider constituency. Young people are now talking about this. Black young people are now talking about this. They are tweeting the images that they find most upsetting. So, for example, statues of black slaves, without any comment, without any context, images that actually traumatize them and make, for them, visiting the museums difficult. So I'm all for that. The big museums, like the British museums, largely, I'm afraid, remain extremely traditional and opposed to telling the colonial stories. I've found that smaller regional museums, which tend to be under the aegis of local councils, which can be very radical, especially ones with large immigrant populations, they tend to be extremely experimental and interesting and are doing wonderful work opening up the museums to new constituencies, especially, for example, schools that have got large ethnic diversity in them. So it's a complicated picture, and it'll be quite clear to you from my lecture where I stand on all of this. I think that we can make museums far more exciting by being honest about their history. Then they can educate not only in ancient Greece and Rome and Mesopotamia and Egypt and Achaemenid Iran, but also the history of our European, Western European, post-Renaissance cultures.
Thank you very much for this very clear answer, actually. We have a number of questions in our Q&A session, and the first one is that you stated that non-specialists from across the social spectrum helped to build classical collections in European museums. However, you focused on British initiatives. Could we point out differences or similarities between England and Europe, and in particularly, of course, in our case, the Netherlands?
Absolutely. I think the issue of the relationship of the museum to European imperialism is one that won't go away, okay? We can't solve 500 years of European imperialism and colonialism. We cannot solve it in terms of its presentation in the arts and the media in the 50 or 60 years that there's been strong post-colonial critique of the museum. We're right at the beginning. We're right at the beginning. We're going to need 500 years to solve this properly, right? So what we need is a really good discussion of it. There are very strong parallels between the British and the French experience. In fact, there was a race in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There was an actual race between French museums and the British Museum to get great things. When the Germans, from Egypt or from Greece, the British Museum itself was founded to try and rival the Louvre. This is why it was founded. And when the Germans started joining in with things like the Pergamon altar, I don't know as much about the Dutch situation, but my instinct is that because your colonial history has been in the sort of Indochina, And in, say, Suriname, I happen to have had some experience teaching in the Netherlands of Surinamese immigrant children. These are different collections. I don't know whether you've got museums of Indo-Chinese exhibits. I bet you have, because there's a very strong relationship between, in your case, I was talking about the granite industry, but I'm quite sure that your history of pottery and chinoiserie and japonaserie and so on is related to your imperial experience. That may not, though, be quite so relevant to us people who are talking about the Greco-Roman inheritance.
My personal opinion is indeed that in the Netherlands, Greco-Roman museums and Greco-Roman collections are less clearly connected to the practices of Dutch imperialism than in France and Britain and also in German would be the case.
I'm sure you're right.
A second question was actually a follow-up on this one. You mentioned that we're right at the beginning of this movement of diversity, of different backgrounds, of making these visible. And in the end of your lecture, you make a plea that museums should do more to show how the public has inspired the museum, etc., etc. But do you think they will? Do you think this is indeed the beginning of a discussion? Or will these museums and university institutions turn back into their normal elitist self after the diversity wind has blown over, so to speak?
Oh, well, you're asking me to get a crystal ball and predict the political future of the planet.
It's an opinion. It's an opinion.
Okay, I will cite the Agamemnon and Eilon Aper, but good prevailed to the unicato. I am a pessimist of the intellect and an optimist of the will. And I think, having talked to Lorien at some length about this, and also to my friend Vinnie Norskov in Aarhus, I think there are many people so wonderfully committed to the diversification of the experience of the museum that we have to be hopeful. And I've done my bit just trying to document the history of classical artifacts in Britain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course you can, Loring.
Yeah, I was wondering, since our Greco-Roman collections are not so tied to these colonial, direct colonial ties of the Netherlands. However, I do get the notion from the public lately that they feel that we should be more explicit about the circumstances in which these collections were obtained. So, for example, Egypt for the Second World War was, of course, part of the British Empire, and a large part of our collection from Egypt was obtained and collected during those times. So do you feel that we should be more explicit about, that museums could be more explicit about their, about the provenance of their collections? And is that do you have some examples in the UK where museums do so?
Yes, I do think at all times they should be explicit. I think one of the problems of the very concept of the museum is that its objects detach from context. And that's context not just from, where they were originally found, but also context in terms of the people who are often incredibly colourful and exciting, like Berzoni, the fair man, strong man who went and got all the Egyptian stuff. I think that if we should open up discussion. This doesn't mean that they all have to be sent back to whatever we think their homes are. It just means that we open up the discussion. I would like to know exactly how the amazing finds, for example, in the Leiden Rijksmuseum got there. Who paid for them? Whose money was it? Why? That is an interesting question without attributing any blame. I have no idea. I've been around that museum. I went around that museum 50 times when I was teaching at Leiden, and I don't really know where the stuff came from.
This ties in very nicely with the comment made in the Q&A that also in the Netherlands, wealthy families known for making collection, of course, make their money and fortune in trades and businesses which are highly dubious from a modern perspective,
yes,
a present day perspective, and that indeed they should make this visible.
Yes, I think the important thing is to not sound judgmental, keep it very factual and fun, okay? I think that the visitor to the museum, if provided with just basic information, can then make up their own mind, right? But transparency, the analogy that always strikes me is actually 19th century philology on fragments. So the great enterprises like Diels Krantz or collecting all the tragic fragments and putting them in a book and saying the fragments of Greek tragedy, without saying who quoted them, what context they were in. Was it in an Athenaeus talking about fish? You know, so people are now saying we need to take that fragment of text and find out how it was preserved, because that may really affect how we interpret it. And it seems to me that the same went on with museums, that they actually tried to create a sterile place for old things without having the sort of history of either their original context or who it was who got them into those museums in the first place. But I don't think we should be imposing an opinion on people. I mean, I'm sure we'll move on to the Parthenon sculptures later, but I am a proud member of the British Committee for reunifying the Parthenon sculptures with their fellows in the Acropolis Museum. That is my personal view. But I know many people have a different view. I still think the British Museum should be putting up more information about how they got there. And then people will make up their own minds.
Thank you. There are many issues at the same time at the moment, which I'm seeing. And we have a question from somebody who's a high school teacher and who teaches classical culture on high school. And she says it's a big part of the curriculum, but it mostly focuses on the elites in ancient society, of course. And how can a teacher make sure that the story she tells their pupils, their students, is more than what's in the books? And how can museums, such as the museums in which we're in now, help schools make that switch?
I think this is a really, really good and important question. So that lies in the management of museums, the executive power of museums, who gets to take the decisions, and how much consultation they do with, for example, the school teaching community. I feel that museums should have on their boards school teachers who say what we would like for our students, or how does this fit with the curriculum. I've been working with the British Museum precisely on how our classical civilization and ancient history modules on the official curriculum can be tied to exhibitions, and I'm making them get things out of their store cupboards to do precisely with, say, slavery, and saying, why don't we have a temporary exhibition entirely about ancient slavery? This requires imagination and cooperation. And, you know, if you've got a school teacher, hello, whoever you are, fantastic question, saying that, why isn't she or he on a board at her local museum saying, here are my ideas for a temporary exhibition?
Thank you. On this, as a follow-up, and it's something which you started yourself, at some point in your lecture, you discussed brick makers and coal miners who identify with masons and soldiers in the Roman world. And this is an argument that we hear more often when discussing the inclusive antiquity, that in order for underprivileged groups to pay more attention to classics, we should refocus our discipline. And in a way, I sometimes feel that this is equally stigmatizing. Should we not ensure for all social groups equal access to the glories of antiquity, such as Praxiteles, Virgil, the Arapachis, rather than focusing on different subjects for different groups? What do you think?
Well, I don't want to focus on different subjects for different groups. That was the last thing I would want to do. And I would be absolutely the last person to say, let's stop talking about the Arapachis or Virgil, other aesthetic highlights of classical antiquity. I can't think of anything worse, but surely there's room for both looking at the Arapachis or at the Parthenon sculptures and looking at how actually an ordinary craftsman made a pot in classical Athens. Our museums are so full of red and black figure Greek vases, but trying to find out exactly how those were made is extraordinarily difficult, let alone how they arrived in the museums. And I can't imagine that anybody wouldn't be interested in looking both at the finest amphora by Ezekias and seeing a local person, a potter, a real potter, showing you how they did it, right? Why can't we have both?
So
I see no contradiction.
Yeah, so it's adding to rather than reorienting the focus.
Exactly. Enrichment.
Yes. Another point, and you mentioned already the Parthenon marbles, and you promised us that we would come back to it. And you seem to be criticizing the way they have arrived in the British Museum and the way they are presented at the moment. And you emphasize in your lecture the contributions to museum collections by the poor and the uneducated through finds, through outdoor activities. And you give the example of Isabel Cutter and the Corbridge Langs. Now, even though I do not want to diminish these types of contributions, I would also say that they are usual unintentional and accidental, and sometimes not always legal. So why would we look upon these contributions more favorably than those by Lord Elgin, other than that they have been done by different class members? Because
it's interesting. I would say it's just incredibly interesting. I find when I tell people these kinds of stories, if you put by the Lanks in the British Museum, the story of Isabel Cutter, how incredibly exciting is that going to be for the 9-year-old girls who go and see that thing, right? Maybe that will make them look more closely in the mud next time they're out playing on the river bank. I think it's a fantastic story. Lord Elgin, I don't approve of what he did, but he did it. I wouldn't be too judgmental about that. What I would be very judgmental about is the deplorable way in which they're exhibited currently in the British Museum. This gallery is pathetic. The roof leaks. I mean, it's dismal. It's utterly dismal. And there is no attempt whatsoever to tell the story of, as I tried to then with just one example of an artwork inspired by it. They could do so much with the impact that those sculptures, and I don't call them marbles. Marbles implies no craft went into them. They're just chunks of stone. It's Parthenon sculptures, okay, that these incredible artworks have inspired artists throughout history ever since. I also think that, I didn't talk about this, but in an era of 3D printing, we could actually, for example, recreate the entire experience of the Parthenon at the British Museum, which would be far more exciting for young people, right? The whole experience, every sculpture, what it's like to walk around, what it's like to see the great statue of Athena Parthenos. We could recreate that with Sonnet Lumiere and 3D printing. and still reunite the actual stones with their comrades in the Acropolis Museum. People just are not thinking about what new technology, right? I saw a fantastic thing in the Leiden Race Museum when I was there, with an illuminated version of Nineveh. It was brilliant, right? And the kids just loved it. You don't need to have any real Nineveh there at all.
No.
None, right?
Yeah.
It still makes the museum the place every school child wants to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question from our Q&A discusses the wider context of museum objects, and stating that people from classics and archaeologists are not alone, because the issue of providing context and provenance seems a much larger concern for museums, stretching beyond colonially or imperially acquired antiquities. Many paintings were detached and removed from altar pieces in churches. Let's say this attachment from its specific context at the time is a much wider phenomenon. Shouldn't all these be reappropriated and providing therefore a wider acceptance base for what we are doing in our particular field of antiquity?
Yeah, well, I think that there's two separate issues there. One is aesthetic and intellectual, and the other is to do with the morality of taking things away from one community and keeping them in another. Aesthetically, there seems to be no question whatsoever that the more we can do to explain how any particular ancient fresco or pot or whatever it is, or statue, how the more we can do to explain how it would have been understood by its ancient viewer, the better, obviously. And I know many museums try to do that now, with big photographs behind them and videos and so on. Aesthetically, this is absolutely crucial. That's one of the main problems with the Devine Gallery in the British Museum for the Parthenon marbles, is that there is no sense that these were part of a Gesamt Kunstwerk that wasn't just even the Parthenon, it was the whole Acropolis, right? It was an entire experience. So that's the aesthetic argument. The political argument is another. And as I said, I wouldn't want to be personally legislating this. Of course I wouldn't, but I think we need to provide people with the information about how things arrived. I don't know, short films, short videos that you can press and click and look at while you're looking at it, but not make the judgment. Leave people to make their own inferences about the rightfulness of the removal of that object from its original home in Greece or Rome or Sumer or wherever it is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would also add that there are also practical concerns. Many of the contexts, of course, are gone or only fragmentarily known, which, you know, gives you issues of authenticity to deal with as well, making it extremely hard. I think I have one final question from the chat, and which is also of a concern here. Do you see in this reorientation or this plea for a different role of museums that should make visible more the role of the public in the acquisition of objects, a special role for university museums such as the Allard Pierson, in which we are at the moment, at this very moment, at least we are. And so a special role for university museums.
Yes, I do. And that's because you have the research skills, right? You are trained and have access to many other different kinds of humanities scholars who can help you find out those provenances. Because to find out about Isabel Cutter, I had to go and read legal registries, right, in Yorkshire, which I am no expert in, right? I need to ask a historian at my university, right, how do I access the legal records on Tyneside? You see what I mean? We have some research skills, but the provenance stories are so exciting, but finding them out may be very difficult indeed. The reason I chose that one is because although we know that certainly with Roman Britain, the vast majority of the finds were there because of working class people, the vast majority, right? We don't usually know their names, they weren't recorded. In the case of Isabel Cotter, you know, we should be cheering because we know who she was, right? And what her father did and how old she was. But you could create a really massive research project through the whole of Amsterdam Museum Humanities and Leiden Humanities for finding out, right, how did we get this stuff? Who were the people? Even your business school colleagues will be able to tell you, you know, just like they can tell you who the first Elsevier was, right? They can help you. So you could actually turn the museum into the center of an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research effort.
Well, thank you. This is very inspiring, and I think we'll have to refigure our research program at the university after this lecture. If there are no further questions from the Q&A, I think we've had a wonderful presentation and a wonderful start of a discussion, which I'm sure will continue for quite some time, at least in this week, Classics Week that we have in the Netherlands. So personally, I'd like to thank you very, very much for an inspiring presentation. And I look to Laurien if there are any last words to close up this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edith. I think we should have a talk afterwards to get that research project started. But as Gert-Jan said, well, definitely the discussion points that came up and the questions that were raised, we're gonna highlight again this week in during other events at the other Pierson, but also at the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden. So I thank you all very much for watching and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.